everybody. Let's talk about a new book, The Fountains of Silence, by Ruta Sepetys. The book is set in Spain. It's set during the time of General Franco's regime during his dictatorship in Spain. He came into power actually in 1939. He was helped into power by Hitler and Mussolini. But he stayed in power until actually the late 1970s. I think he died in 1975, and he stayed in power until his death. So he was in power for a very long time, and he kept Spain extremely isolated, culturally, technology-wise. So by the time this book is happening in the late 1950s, he's been in power for quite a while already, and Spain has been very isolated, so they're very behind, and the economy has almost collapsed. People are extremely poor. And Franco decides that he's going to allow some Americans in for tourism, but he's also going to do some business with them, particularly the oil business. So he allows Charles Hilton to build this big lavish hotel across from the American embassy in Madrid. And this is where kind of the Americans start to flock. And this young woman whose parents had been Republicans, and that is who Franco the Civil War was against, and that's who he won against. And he was really cruel to people who had fought against him, and a lot of them were thrown into prison. Many of them were executed. Anna, in this case, her parents were executed, and she and her family were kind of left to raise themselves. She is in her late teens. I think she's about 18 years old at the time the book begins. And she goes to work in the Hilton Hotel, where she meets this young man who has come from America with his father, who is a businessman. He is a photojournalist, and he gets very interested in trying to understand what's going on in Spain at the time. And there are some really horrific things that happen during Franco's regime, and I think that a lot of it we're fairly unfamiliar with. Now, at the time, Americans probably did know. They chose to kind of ignore it because they wanted to do business in Spain. And there's always been controversy about that. There was then and there is now about whether we supported Franco's regime and allowed some of those things to happen because we were economically kind of holding him up by agreeing to do business in Spain. But other people argue that it actually did help a lot economically, and therefore helped the Spanish people. But I think that's part of what's interesting about reading this book is learning a lot about things that were happening in Spain in the 50s and 60s and even in the 70s that most people are fairly unfamiliar with. It's, part of European history that we just don't really learn much about. And I think you will be surprised by some of the atrocities that were actually going on. If you've never heard of the Lost Children of Spain, that gets into this a little bit, that Franco often took children away from their parents. He would tell Republican parents that their children had died when they were born, and then he would sell them off. They would adopt them for large sums of money, and sometimes to Americans. So it is extraordinarily interesting. It is very well written. If you like historic fiction, the story is great. It keeps you moving through, but you're learning so many interesting things that I think would be interesting to look at later on. It also includes these really neat quotes along the way. These are sections that came out of reports or cables going back and forth from the embassy to the U.S. government. So things from the president and the ambassadors that have been declassified over the years, and things that they were saying about the regime and Franco and what was going on in Spain. And so I think it's a really interesting look into what we actually knew and why we made the decisions, or why the government made the decisions that they made. So if you love historic fiction, if you're interested in Spain, there's a little bit of a love story. So it is really well written. You're going to enjoy it. I enjoyed it very much. It is called The Fountains of Silence, Ruta Sepetys. Give it a try.